Dawn, the 9th of December, 1992. American Marines storm ashore at Mogadishu, capital of Somalia. They call it humanitarian intervention. But is it going to be a quick surgical operation or the beginning of a new imperialism?
I don't think anybody questions that the United States wants to colonize Africa. It's the last thing in the world the United States wants to do, but nevertheless it may be forced into the position where it becomes, in effect, the de facto colonial governor, albeit always, I think, in cooperation with the United Nations or with some international authority.
Only a generation ago, Africa demanded independence from colonial rule, and got it. Now the unthinkable is happening, and some Africans are asking for foreign powers to return.
I'm sorry to say this because this is an admission on my part that my continent, my societies may not have been prepared for self-rule, that maybe independence was given to Africa prematurely.
Today the Americans are being drawn into Africa. Yesterday it was the British. In Westminster Abbey, among the nation's great figures, is the grave of David Livingstone. Inscribed on the tomb are his dying words: "May heaven's rich blessings come down on everyone, American, English or Turk, who will help to heal this open sore of the world." More than 100 years ago, David Livingstone, the missionary and explorer, called on the world to save Africa from slavery and poverty. His plea for humanitarian intervention contributed to the European takeover of Africa. Today, less than 3 years since the last African colony became independent, foreign forces are back on the continent, trying to save Africa. It's called humanitarian intervention, but will it inevitably lead, as before, to an imperial takeover? Livingstone's adventures in Africa to find the source of the Nile and spread Christianity are legendary. He reached the heart of the continent and discovered a shockingly brutal slave trade. Slavery, it was thought, had been stopped years before. Suddenly, the world was told that it was thriving. Children, as well as men and women, were being dragged from Africa, sold as slaves and exported to Arabia. When Victorian England read about the horrors Livingstone had found, it was outraged. And the demand for intervention was irresistible.
This was Livingstone's signal, and he was pointing at the heart of Africa, saying, come in, save Africa and use trade to do it. So it was going to be peaceful penetration without the gun, using trade and the Bible together.
King Leopold of Belgium saw in Livingstone's plea a chance to carve a new kingdom. The king claimed the whole of the centre of the continent around the Congo River and made it his own personal empire. The other European nations, perturbed by this sudden grab for Africa, began to establish their own claims. The scramble for Africa was on. At Berlin in 1884, the great powers, led by Britain, France and Germany, met and divided up Africa between them. Even the unexplored parts were parcelled out into spheres of influence. They simply drew lines on a map.
Well, most of them are very arbitrary, and you can see the ones that are ruled. And they were just ruled on a map in Europe by two sets of officials negotiating, foreign office officials from each country. The more interesting squiggly ones are where they decided that they didn't know anything about that country. It was terra incognita, but they'd go by the watershed when they discovered it. So you could say, all right, when we find the way the river runs, that will be the border.
Europeans were already settling in some parts of Africa, which they believed would become white-ruled colonies, like Canada or Australia. In its imperial mission, Europe took over other areas to rule the native inhabitants for their own good. But they were put to work as the continent was opened up for economic exploitation. Instead of being set free, Africa was taken over by imperialists who believed in their racial and cultural superiority and governed accordingly. But the Second World War had questioned the basis of imperialism, for example, in the Horn of Africa.
For another 10 years, the Italians, under the United Nations, are to be responsible for Somaliland.
In 1950, Italy was entrusted with preparing its former colony, Somalia, for independence. A spirit of self-determination had been released across Africa. Campaigns for self-rule spread like wildfire, and the imperial powers were faced with demands for independence now. The Somali trusteeship was to last 10 years.
At the end of that time, they and the world hope that the Somalis will have learnt the art and detail of self-government and will be able to rule themselves as a modern independent state.
The name Gold Coast passes, long live Ghana. Joyful citizens...
Ghana was the first African country to get its freedom. With the slogan "Self-Rule Now," Kwame Nkrumah swept to power, with Britain accepting the inevitable and handing over graciously. This was a moment of enormous hope for Ghana, then a rich and rapidly developing country, and a historic moment for all of Africa. An era of freedom and prosperity seemed to have begun. But as he came to power, Nkrumah spoke these disturbingly prophetic words. "It is the right of us Africans to manage or mismanage our own affairs." As Russia and America poured weapons into the continent, it slid deeper and deeper into crisis. Neither superpower was interested in the real needs of Africa. To them, it was just a battleground. African statesmen are bitter.
Big powers, because they wanted to use certain leaders for their own purposes, they have literally propped up gangsters. They've paraded them as leaders, praising them. People of the West, yeah. Leading thugs and putting them in a place of power because they can lead them, they can tell them what to do, and they use them for their own selfish purposes.
Nowhere has Africa's collapse been so catastrophic as in Somalia. Its strategic position on the Indian Ocean made it a prime target for superpower rivalry, and Somalia was unlucky enough to have been an ally of first one and then the other superpower. When the country disintegrated in civil war, it was like one huge arsenal of guns, mines, bullets and bombs, all made in America and Russia. The Somalis turned the weapons on each other, and as in so many other conflicts, war brought famine. The only fertile region was raped and pillaged for 2 years running. When food aid did arrive, much of it rotted in warehouses. Armed gangs prevented it from reaching the hungry, and what was once a sovereign nation tore itself apart.
Somalia should not have any pretensions to sovereignty because we have just abused our sovereignty, and our only hope is for the international community to help us towards a political reconstruction.
At last, help did come. America sent 30,000 Marines with helicopters, tanks, and their full combat equipment. They looked like an invasion force, but they were backed by a United Nations mandate. The UN itself had already tried and failed to bring relief and security to starving Somalis. Washington stressed that the mission had no ulterior motive. The Marines were here to do a humanitarian job and get out. The people welcomed the Marines on the streets, but it was a welcome born of despair. These journalists worked in constant fear of their lives throughout the war to produce a daily news sheet to inform and entertain the people of Mogadishu. they have no illusions about who has created the mess their country's in. They blame Somalis.
We can't blame anybody because it's our people who have done this. No other intervention came and destroyed Somalia. And we Somalis have destroyed this, and we should have to accept whatever comes.
But is there another type of leadership emerging in Somalia?
Somalia is under the UNITAF, the Unified Task Force, a military coalition led by the United States.
So the United States is really ruling Somalia?
Yes, in some way, the United States ruling Somalia.
Are you happy with that?
Most of the people can accept that. We have been forced to accept that.
The Stars and Stripes now flies over the capital. The streets are patrolled by Americans. Their influence is everywhere. But the men commanding this operation are sensitive to suggestions of a takeover. Americans are terrified of being sucked into an imperialist role. Robert Oakley is the US Special Envoy in Mogadishu. His experience in Vietnam forged his attitude to intervention.
You don't want to get yourself in the situation of being the world's policeman. On the other hand, I think that in a situation like this, where a country has gotten itself totally out of control, it's worth doing it.
Is there a temptation, though, to behave like an imperial power and just do things for the Somalis?
Absolutely, and everyone falls into that. There is a temptation to say, well, all Somalis are hopeless, therefore we will save them by doing it for them. And it is a neo-imperialist point of view. And as I said, having watched our own experiences in Vietnam, I think it is doomed to failure.
Mr. Oakley is on the spot, but the big decisions are taken back in Washington. The Secretary of State for Defense during the Bush administration explains that the American intervention was a last resort.
Humanitarian relief organizations had been unable to cope. The UN had been unable to cope, and the only option that remained was for the US to directly intervene with military force, and so we did. But only after we'd satisfied ourselves that we had a mission we could accomplish, that the risk to our troops, while it wasn't minimal, it clearly wasn't that great, that we could wrap things up. That is, we could see the end game. We could see how we could ultimately turn it over to the United Nations and withdraw our forces.
America seems always torn between the temptation to intervene and the instinct to be isolationist. Michael Clough is an Africa specialist who advised President Clinton during his election campaign.
I think the problem in America is there is no consistent mood. There is in fact this schizophrenia. We want to pull back from the world, but at the same time we find that the pictures are too immediate. And once the public pressure begins to build, it becomes very hard to say, oops, we don't do that anymore.
I don't know what level I'm at. 1, 2,
hey,
3,
Doug,
4,
how's
5,
wash
6,
bars
7,
now
8,
on? The 124?
It looks good. Sorry.
18 months ago, Somalia was on nobody's agenda. It had not been discovered by television. As in Livingstone's time, it was tales of suffering that were to galvanize public opinion.
6 in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Julian on 1, please.
Death by hunger in a world of food.
This is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw.
This is the last day in the life of Fida Ibrahim. It hurts to die of starvation.
Television news wasn't interested in Somalia until pictures like these began to emerge. But once they discovered Somalia, the networks, particularly the American ones, knew how to milk the images for maximum effect. The politicians were forced to act, but not for the first time.
The first real humanitarian crisis in Africa that created this dynamic was Biafra. And at the time, Lyndon Johnson reportedly said in a White House meeting, "I don't care what you do, just get those goddamn nigger babies off my TV set." Now, Lyndon Johnson was more graphic than anybody would ever be in a Clinton administration, but Lyndon Johnson understood then the dynamics of public pressure for intervention. He knew that he wasn't doing anything in Biafra because he cared about Biafra or because he even knew where Nigeria was. He was doing it because there were pictures of starving babies on his TV sets.
But if the public reason for intervention was humanitarian, There was another possible motive for President Bush to send in the Marines. The Pentagon and America's 1.5 million strong armed forces are facing cutbacks. Their role at the end of the Cold War is in doubt. Somalia could give them a new role and allow them to keep their $300 billion budget.
Where's the rifles? I need rifles. Lots of rifles, and I can go home.
There's always the rationale that somehow it's budget-driven, or this marks a desire by the generals and the admirals to keep their hands on as big a part of the pie as possible. That's not the way the system works. In reality, people were in need. The president made a decision. We saluted smartly and carried it out.
However, the general commanding the Marines in Somalia, in his makeshift headquarters, believes this is an opportunity for his men.
I think it's a significant step that shows that military forces can do a wide range of operations that are useful to the overall peace of the world, and I think humanitarian is one that we do pretty well. We find our young Marines and soldiers are politically, I think, sophisticated. They understand the politics of what's going on.
One of y'all take the bottom floor. Yep, I got the top. This bottom.
But the idealistic notions of the general are in marked contrast to the cynicism shown by some of his men on the streets. They think there's yet another motive.
There's already American contractors here bidding to rebuild this joint. You're going to tell them, that's all the Defense Department is. We're bodyguards for American contractors. That's when I was disillusioned.
And he's equally damning about the United Nations, whose mandate he's supposed to be carrying out.
The UN? They don't. No, we own the UN. U.S. government owns the UN. We foot the bill for the UN. UN does what we want them to, except for who? Libya and Cuba. So what? If we wanted to go in there in a week, we'd take those over if we wanted to anyways. But we foot the bill for the UN. They'll vote how we want them to vote. That's just that's a U.S. puppet. You guys should know that. You've been to college. I haven't.
In Somalia, the UN has been a disaster. When it was needed, it could neither provide starving people with food nor security to protect it. Eventually, after protracted negotiations to bring a traditional peacekeeping force to Somalia, 500 Pakistani troops arrived at Mogadishu airport. And there they stayed. They didn't escort a single food convoy, and they relied for their own safety on the goodwill of local warlords. So the Americans stepped in with a shoot-first mandate.
All right, I'm going on.
In theory, they were limited to protecting humanitarian aid in the famine zone. In practice, the Americans are learning that intervention brings with it boundless responsibilities. They're now providing the nearest thing to a government that Somalia has. This is the daily meeting of the American military, UN officials and aid workers.
A sweep was made through the Argentine arms market, and an undetermined amount of ammunition and a number of weapons were confiscated.
There's no doubt about who's in charge and drawing up the agenda.
Incidentally, the Super Bowl scores are posted on the door for anyone who's interested. Convoys today.
Then come the decisions about where convoys go, who gets fed, which areas get protection. There are echoes of the colonial past, and as then, Somalis don't make the decisions, and few of them are consulted. This is the face of the new imperialism.
Try to do it at least 2 days in advance.
The American presence has given these policemen the courage to meet for parade for the first time in 2 years at Mogadishu police headquarters. But there's no government to serve or to pay them. These men can't challenge the heavily armed gangs. Who should disarm them? The Americans say it's not their job. They don't want to get too involved.
It pushes you too deep into the fabric of their country. It makes you clearly imperialist. Furthermore, it has the undesirable side effect that you become instantly responsible for the security of all the people you disarmed in what is a very dangerous environment. And you don't want that responsibility.
There are few jobs in Mogadishu's wrecked economy, and the Americans are now a major employer. Hundreds queue up every day outside the port in the hope of being chosen for work. The port is run by the American military, and private American companies, which have been contracted by American aid. There's little to be proud of here, back in Somalia. What used to be its prosperous, elegant capital is proof that if the rest of the world ignores a country in trauma, things only get worse. In the end, there has to be intervention. But once outsiders do intervene, can they solve the problems which caused the breakdown in the first place? And if not, how can they ever leave? Villa Somalia was the presidential palace. Its devastation has been untouched for over 2 years now, a symbol of Somalia's total destruction. There's no state structure of any sort left. It's a palace of death. This is where the last vestige of government collapsed and the country disintegrated into terminal violence. Somalia is now like a patient in intensive care. American military intervention administered the anesthetic and neutralized the disease, violence. But now comes the hard part, a life-saving operation to secure a political settlement. And then there's the long haul of recovery, nation rebuilding. The Americans want to leave that part to the United Nations, but US officials admit in private that the UN isn't capable of doing the job. So the Americans won't do it, and the UN can't. And the danger is that Somalia, having been rescued from the brink of oblivion, now slips back into the grip of the disease. Somalia, a man-made catastrophe, is not unique. There will be more Somalias, and the world has got to find a way of dealing with them. Is American-style intervention the answer?
Peace and security in the world, to a large extent, depend upon the United States. The United Nations functions effectively in no small part because of the ability and the willingness of the United States to support it, to provide the troops to kick Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, to organize the international coalition that successfully concluded the Cold War. The world is, to a large extent, dependent upon U.S. leadership and U.S. military power, and that's not likely to change anytime in the near future.
But the Americans are learning that intervention, even for the best motives, is intervention. Whatever the quick fix plan, once you're in, it's hard to get out. And the danger is you have to take on an imperialist role.